The sky above the jagged cliffs bled an unnatural shade of crimson, reflecting off the shattered bones scattered across the hunting grounds. The air reeked of blood and ash, a sharp, metallic scent that clung to everything, even the wind. In the distance, the towering pack of draken beasts howled their victory to the heavens, their monstrous silhouettes barely visible against the fading light. They had feasted well. The weak had been culled. Among the aftermath of broken carcasses and shredded sinew, a small, quivering shape lay half buried in the dirt. A cub barely a few feet long, its scales slick with blood. It drew shallow, ragged breaths, its ribs shuddering with the effort. One of its hind legs was bent at a sickening angle, its talons twitching weakly. The creature's golden eyes, once sharp with instinctual hunger, flickered like a dimming flame. Rax was the runt. The pack had turned on him with savage efficiency. The draken beasts knew no mercy, only the survival of the strongest. When the Alpha had roared his verdict, the others had descended upon Rax without hesitation. His siblings, beasts he had shared warmth and food with, had torn into his flesh until his body no longer moved. Only then did they leave him for dead. The strong feasted, the weak fed the earth. That was the way. The twilight deepened and the sounds of the world faded, swallowed by the encroaching silence of death. Rax's vision began to blur. The icy chill of death seeped into his bones. For the first time in his short, brutal life, he felt fear, not of pain, but of the stillness that would follow. That was when the sound of unfamiliar footsteps cut through the quiet. "Captain, over here! You need to see this!" Rax blinked slowly, his golden eyes shifting toward the shapes moving across the ridge. There were 4 of them, bipedal, upright creatures, covered in strange armor-like suits that glinted under the darkening sky. Their helmets obscured their faces, but their voices were clear, laced with tension and awe. They moved differently from the draken beasts, cautiously, deliberately, as though every step was a calculated risk. Humans. The leader, Captain Ezra Vaughn, lowered his weapon as he approached the small, broken cub. His gaze swept over the carnage, lingering on the grotesque remains left behind by the predator pack. His expression was unreadable behind his helmet, but there was something unmistakable in the way he knelt beside the creature. A flicker of reluctant compassion. "Lee," he called, his voice low. "What do you make of it?" Dr. Ashen Lee approached, her scanner already humming to life. The device bathed Rax in a cold, blue light as she analyzed his condition. "It's young, very young," Lee murmured. "Barely a juvenile. Broken leg, puncture wounds. He's dying." She paused, narrowing her eyes at the readings. "But it's regenerating. Slowly, but it is." Ezra frowned. "Regenerating?" Lee nodded, a strange mixture of fascination and concern creeping into her voice. "The cellular activity. It's off the charts. Whatever it is, it's not giving up." The cub gave a faint, pitiful growl, a sound so weak it barely escaped its throat. Sergeant Cole, a stocky man with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward, rifle slung over his shoulder. He stared down at the cub with a grimace. "Doesn't look like it'll make it, sir. Best to let nature finish what it started." Ezra hesitated, His instincts told him that Cole was right. This world was savage. Anything too weak to survive on its own was already dead. And yet, "Captain," Lee's voice was softer now, almost pleading. "We can't just leave it. It's not like the others. It was cast out. We don't know why, but it was left to die alone." Ezra exhaled slowly. The shadows pressed in around them, and in the distance the wind carried the faint echoes of distant howls. Other predators roaming the wilderness, scavengers closing in. He knew they were out of time. He looked down at the cub, at its cracked scales and too thin frame. The creature's eyes met his, and for a brief, unnerving moment, something passed between them. Not understanding, something older. Recognition, perhaps. "Against protocol," Cole muttered, shaking his head. "You know that, right?" Ezra rose to his feet and activated his comms. "Prepare the containment chamber. We're bringing it back." Cole swore under his breath, but Lee's face lit up with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Rax felt hands, strange, alien hands, lift him from the blood-soaked ground. The pain flared briefly before fading into a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The darkness pressed against him again, but this time it didn't feel so final. The human voices faded into the background as his vision dimmed. Somewhere deep in the primal parts of his mind, a seed was planted. A connection, fragile and incomplete, but undeniable. He would not die today. The pack had abandoned him, but these creatures, these fragile, strange beings, had not. The last thing Rax saw before unconsciousness took him was the shimmer of the human outpost in the distance, a fragile beacon of metal and light in a world of shadows and death. The hum of the containment room's reinforced energy field filled the air, a steady, dull thrum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the outpost. The room was small, sterile, and lined with thick panels of reinforced alloy designed to hold volatile life forms. The single observation window glowed faintly in the dim overhead lights. Inside the chamber, the cub lay motionless on the padded surface, its breathing slow but steady. Dr. Ashen Lee stood by the glass, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed as she monitored the creature's vitals displayed on a nearby console. Data flickered across the screen, elevated metabolic rates, accelerated tissue repair, and cell activity far beyond anything in recorded biology. The more she watched, the more questions clawed at her mind. Still no sign of infection? Captain Vaughn's voice cut through the quiet as he approached from behind, arms folded. Lee shook her head. No infection, no fever, nothing. Whatever this thing's body is doing, it's deliberate. Not a defense mechanism, a design. Vaughn frowned as he leaned in to study the cub. It looked different already. Its scales, once dull and cracked from injury, gleamed with renewed life, a deep obsidian hue that rippled under the low light. The fractured leg had almost completely reset, the once shattered bone now reinforced with dense, hardened growths like armor plating. The cub was growing, fast. How much longer before it wakes up? Vaughn asked. Lee checked the monitor again, hesitating before answering. Not long, and when it does, it might be hungry. Great, Sergeant Cole muttered from the doorway, his rifle slung over his shoulder. As if it wasn't bad enough already. What happens when it realizes we're the easiest snack in the room? He glanced at the creature's claws, longer now, curved like sickles. We should have put a round in its skull when we had the chance. Lee shot him a glare. It's not just some wild animal. We've never seen anything like this before. This could be one of the most important biological discoveries of the last century. Cole snorted. Yeah? Important until it rips someone in half. Before Lee could retort, the creature stirred, its claws flexed, scraping lightly against the containment floor. All three of them froze, watching as the cub's eyes slowly opened. The amber light of its gaze pierced the glass, molten and sharp. Rax blinked slowly, his vision adjusting to the dimness. The faint pain that had haunted his limbs was gone. The hunger, however, remained, a gnawing emptiness that twisted in his belly. But there was something else too, an unfamiliar awareness. The small creatures in front of him weren't his kind. They smelled of metal, strange oils, and warmth. They weren't predators. Too soft, too slow. But they weren't prey either. They had saved him. The memory clung to his mind like a lingering scent. He growled softly, a low rumble that vibrated through the room. Is it testing us? Vaughn muttered, watching the creature's calculated movements. Lee pressed a hand to the glass. It's aware. Look at it. It's observing us. Rax rose to his feet, wobbling slightly before steadying himself. His body felt stronger now, denser, more powerful. He pressed one clawed hand against the glass, mimicking Lee's gesture. His eyes met hers, unblinking. For a moment there was an odd calm in the room. Vaughn and Lee exchanged a look, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted. This wasn't just instinct. It was something more. The calm shattered as the emergency klaxon blared through the outpost. Red warning lights flashed in the hallways as the comm system crackled to life. This is Hammond at the southern perimeter. Something's out here. Some kind of... Oh, God. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Vaughn's blood ran cold. Damn it. Cole grabbed his rifle and swung it over his shoulder. Perimeter's compromised. Let's move. Vaughn glanced back at Lee. Stay here. Keep an eye on it. Lee nodded, though her gaze lingered on Rax, who watched the commotion with unsettling focus. Vaughn and Cole bolted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing through the metal walls. Lee tapped the console to lock the containment room and sealed the blast door for good measure. The hum of the field grew louder, creating a near impenetrable barrier. But something gnawed at her thoughts. Hammond was stationed over half a mile away, too far for a normal ambush. Whatever took him out had to be fast, inhumanly fast. Inside the containment room, Rax's nostrils flared, his pupils dilated, narrowing into dagger-like slits as a new scent reached him, the scent of blood. His growl deepened. He understood that smell. It was death. Moments later, the intercom flared to life again, briefly. They're inside. Too many. Don't let them. The voice cut off with a wet, gurgling noise. Lee's hands trembled as she stared at the speaker. The base door's outer sensors flashed, movement outside. Something was circling the outpost. Several somethings. Rax pressed against the glass, his breathing quickening. His protective instincts surged as the vibrations of something alien echoed through the walls. Then the power flickered. The lights dimmed, the containment field crackled, and for a terrifying second the room went dark. Lee's breath caught in her throat as the power sputtered back on, but weaker now, the field barely holding. She turned just in time to see Rax rear up and slam his massive clawed hand against the glass. Not in attack, but in urgency. His eyes burned with something almost human. Then the first impact hit the outpost walls, a deafening metallic boom that sent dust falling from the ceiling. The sound of claws scraping metal followed, accompanied by the faint, wet sound of flesh stretching and twisting unnaturally. Lee swallowed hard. She realized then that the beast they had brought inside the cradle might be the only thing that could save them from what was already here. Rax growled low and steady, his gaze locked on hers. For a brief, terrifying moment, she thought she understood exactly what he was trying to tell her. "Let me out." The outpost trembled beneath the weight of something massive. Each impact was like the beat of a war drum, shaking the walls and floors, sending tools and consoles crashing to the ground. The emergency lights bathed the corridors in sickly red flashes, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally with every movement. Lee's hands flew across the control panel as she tried to stabilize the flickering power grid. The containment field around Rax sputtered and groaned. A low hum indicated it was barely holding. She could feel the vibration of the creature's heavy breathing through the glass. Another deafening boom resonated through the outpost, closer this time. A sickening screech followed, like metal being peeled apart by raw muscle. Lee's heart pounded in her chest. The perimeter was gone. The walls wouldn't hold. The intercom crackled again, Vaughn's voice cutting through the chaos. Lee, get to the control room. There's something burrowed underneath. It's coming from the ground." His words were ragged, punctuated by gunfire in the background. "We're getting overrun." The world seemed to tilt under her feet as his words sank in. Burrowed underneath? How could that be possible? She turned toward the glass. Rax was pacing now, his talons tapping against the reinforced floor with each step. His eyes locked onto her, burning with urgency. There was no mistaking the message this time. He wanted out. Another impact hit the outpost, this time directly beneath her feet. The floor buckled slightly, groaning under the pressure. A soft cracking sound reverberated through the room, like something pressing against the foundation, straining to break through. Her decision was made for her. Lee slammed her hand on the emergency override. The containment field fizzled out with a low whine, and the reinforced glass slid open. Rax let out a low, rumbling growl as he stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the room. For a split second, Lee was frozen by the sheer size of him. The small, battered cub they had found was gone. In its place stood a predator of terrifying strength. A creature of obsidian scales, jagged bone plating, and golden eyes that glowed like twin fires. His claws flexed, catching the dim light as they dragged across the metal floor. Rax stepped past her, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't even glance at her. His focus was fixed solely on the danger outside. Lee grabbed a rifle from the wall and followed. The hallway outside was chaos. Sparks rained down from ruptured wiring, and smoke curled from the bent, broken walls. Two lifeless bodies of crew members lay sprawled in the corridor, their torsos split open as though something had erupted from inside. Lee gagged at the sight. Their skin had been stretched taut, their rib cages cracked outward. She forced herself to look away, biting back the wave of nausea. Rax let out a warning snarl, his nostrils flaring. Then it came, a skittering, clicking noise from further down the hall, growing louder by the second. Lee raised her rifle, bracing herself. A shape burst into view, an amorphous, writhing mass of slick, pale flesh and chitinous limbs. The parasite creature twisted unnaturally, its bloated body barely recognizable as biological. Thick tendrils writhed from its core, each tipped with spines that scraped along the walls. Its head was a mess of fused bone-like growths, splitting open into a hideous maw filled with spiraling teeth. Lee froze in horror. Rax didn't. The Draken beast lunged forward with a deafening roar, slamming into the parasite with such force that the walls shook. The creature shrieked as Rax's claws tore through its sinewy flesh, sending chunks of viscera splattering across the floor. Dark ichor sprayed across the walls as Rax bit down on the writhing mass, his teeth sinking deep. The parasite's tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Rax's limbs and torso. The beast twisted violently, ripping one of the tendrils free in a shower of gore. His movements were brutal, calculated, far more precise than any wild predator. Lee watched in stunned awe as Rax's tail whipped out, impaling the parasite through what passed for its torso. The creature spasmed once, then went limp. For a moment there was silence. Rax lifted his blood-streaked head and let out a bone-rattling roar that echoed through the outpost. It was a sound of victory and warning. Lee's calm crackled again. Vaughn's voice came through, barely audible over the gunfire. "Lee, report. What the hell's happening over there?" She pressed the comm to her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. Rax took it down. But there's more of them. They're using the tunnels beneath us. A burst of static, then Vaughn's reply. "We've sealed most of the lower access points, but it's not holding. They're breaching through the main bay floor. We need to regroup." Lee nodded, though Vaughn couldn't see her. She turned to Rax, who stood over the shredded corpse of the parasite, his chest rising and falling with deep, measured breaths. "Come on," she said quietly, unsure if he understood her. But he did. Rax stepped forward, his bulk looming over her as they moved through the ruined corridor. The outpost groaned with the weight of the invaders crawling through the walls and floors. They reached the main control room just as Vaughn and Cole barricaded the entrance. Vaughn's face was streaked with sweat and grime, his expression hard but relieved when he saw them. "You let it out?" Vaughn asked, incredulous. Lee nodded, breathing heavily. "We didn't have a choice." Vaughn's gaze shifted to Rax, who stared back, his golden eyes burning with intelligence and something else. "You're lucky he didn't tear you apart," Cole muttered, keeping his rifle raised. Lee shook her head. "He's not here to kill us. He's here to help." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath their feet shuddered violently. A section of the floor collapsed inward, and from the gaping hole emerged something far larger than the parasites they'd seen before. A massive, bloated abomination covered in layers of bone-like plating and sinewy tendrils. Its eyeless head turned toward them, releasing a guttural, gurgling growl that shook the walls. Rax roared in response, stepping forward. Vaughn's grip tightened on his rifle. "Let's hope you're right about him, Lee. We're out of time." The creature lunged, splitting its body into grotesque sections as it moved, each part writhing and pulsing. Rax didn't hesitate. With the deafening crash, the battle began. The outpost was falling apart. Sparks rained down like fireflies as structural beams groaned under the weight of destruction. Flames licked at the edges of the shattered walls, casting everything in a hellish glow. The storm outside raged, sheets of acid rain and lightning, making the world beyond the crumbling structure blur into chaos. The last of the parasite swarm was dead, their slick, mutilated bodies littering the floor like a grotesque carpet of ruptured flesh and bone. But what stood before them now was something else entirely, a nightmare given form. The Queen. It was a towering amalgamation of sinew and bone, as if the earth itself had vomited up a creature too unnatural to exist. Its elongated torso pulsed with bioluminescent sacs, translucent membranes revealing the writhing brood inside. Its many limbs, thick, jagged appendages ending in barbed talons, dug into the steel floor, anchoring it like the roots of a tree. Its head was a hideous mockery of a crown, a fused array of skeletal horns and flesh, split in two by a maw filled with spiraling teeth. And it was still growing. Captain Vaughn staggered backward, rifle raised, but his arms trembled. "That thing isn't just feeding," he whispered, horror in his voice. "It's becoming something else." Lee stared in stunned silence as the creature's massive frame convulsed. Wet, sickening sounds echoed as new limbs unfolded from its body. Parasites clung to it like veins, writhing and sinking back into its flesh as if they were a part of it. The Queen was reshaping herself. A deep, guttural hum filled the room, a frequency so low it vibrated inside their bones. The Queen wasn't just feeding, it was preparing to spread. "We have to stop it," Lee said, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "If it releases those spores, there won't be a planet left standing." Vaughn nodded grimly. He pointed to the charge pack strapped to his belt. The biobomb. "We detonate this here. Full containment. It'll burn everything. Her, us. All of it." Cole swore, pacing furiously. "There's no way we make it out in time. We're pinned in." Lee clenched her fists. She knew he was right. The blast radius would consume the entire outpost and the surrounding valley. A low growl rumbled behind them. Rax stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the humans. His obsidian scales were slick with blood and ichor, his talons cracked and scarred. His chest rose and fell with deep, labored breaths. Yet his eyes, those molten amber eyes, burned with unbroken resolve. The Queen shrieked, her many limbs twitching in response to Rax's approach. Lee's breath caught in her throat. "No! Rax!" Rax lowered his head and let out a deep, resonant growl that sent shivers through the air. He wasn't hesitating. He understood. Tears welled in Lee's eyes as the realization sank in. He's offering himself. Vaughn swallowed hard. He's buying us time. Before they could stop him, Rax lunged forward, a blur of obsidian muscle and fury. His roar split the air like a thunderclap as he collided with the Queen. The impact shook the outpost, sending debris raining from the ceiling. The Queen screeched, her limbs thrashing as Rax tore into her with savage ferocity. The room became a frenzy of chaos, claws raking flesh, bones snapping, and the wet, visceral sound of flesh being ripped apart. "Go!" Vaughn shouted, grabbing Lee and pulling her toward the exit. Lee stumbled but didn't resist. She forced herself to move, her heart breaking with every step. Cole sprinted ahead, throwing open the hatch to the emergency access corridor. Vaughn set the biobomb's timer to a 30-second countdown and threw it onto the central platform. As they climbed the narrow metal shaft leading to the surface, the sounds of the battle below grew distant. Lee paused at the top of the ladder, looking back one last time through the grated floor. Rax was still fighting. The Queen's tendrils wrapped around his torso, trying to crush him, but Rax's jaws clamped down on her throat, tearing it open in a geyser of black ichor. His body was battered and broken, but he didn't stop. He roared again, a sound of defiance, of rage, of something far more than primal instinct. The Queen spasmed, her limbs flailing wildly as the light in her bioluminescent sacs flickered and dimmed. Rax planted his feet and shoved her back toward the bomb. Lee's vision blurred with tears as Vaughn pulled her the rest of the way up. "Come on, move," Vaughn shouted as they stumbled across the rocky terrain. The storm raged around them, lightning illuminating the ruined outpost below. Then the sky lit up. A blinding white flash erupted from the heart of the outpost, followed by a deafening shockwave that flattened everything in its path. The blast consumed the outpost in an instant, incinerating steel and flesh alike. The force of it hurled them forward, and Lee hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. When she looked up, the outpost was gone. A smoldering crater remained, filled with the ashes of what had been. The storm raged on, rain hissing as it struck the charred ground. Vaughn pulled himself to his feet, groaning in pain. Cole was already standing, staring at the crater with a grim expression. Lee's heart felt hollow. She sank to her knees, staring at the smoking ruins below. He was gone. The cub they had saved, the beast they had raised, the protector who had saved them all. Gone. The silence was unbearable. Vaughn rested a hand on her shoulder. He knew what he was doing, Lee. He chose this. Lee nodded slowly, though the ache in her chest refused to lessen. He wasn't just a predator, she whispered. He was more than that. The storm began to quiet, the clouds thinning as the first rays of dawn pierced the horizon. For a long time they stood there, watching the light chase away the darkness. The nightmare was over, but the cost would linger with them forever. As they turned to leave, Lee cast one final glance at the crater. The ashes swirled in the faint wind. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she thought she saw a massive, shadowed shape standing proud amidst the smoke. But when she blinked, it was gone. The survivors walked toward their shuttle in silence. The world was quiet again, but the memory of the beast who had defied his fate, who had chosen to protect rather than destroy, would never fade. In the stillness of the charred valley, the echoes of his final roar lingered, carried by the wind like a promise. Rax's story had ended in fire and sacrifice, but it would never be forgotten.